Hey there, I wanted to jump on here real quick before the video starts as a bit of a disclaimer. I recorded this video months ago, and in fact, I recorded it 5 separate times. Each time I had significant audio problems. I even used some highly recommended clip-on mics, and ironically enough, that gave me the worst result of all. This is the final version I recorded, and by the time I got done with this video, I just had to complete the project and move on because this is my daily driver. So, this version does have a few audio snafus. Please just bear with me. The information is solid despite any audio problems. If you had any, questions about the Bendix Hydrovac system, how it's installed, how it works, hopefully this answers any questions, clears up any misconceptions. If you are left with questions after this is done, please leave them in the comments for me because I am making a follow-up video for this. This video basically just covers the principles of it, how it works, the install. Beyond that, thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks for watching, and keep on bindering.
Hey there, you're watching Bare Knuckle Binder. Welcome to the channel. I'm going to get right into it. Today I am installing a period correct brake booster system on my 1952 International Harvester L122. Now, an L122 is a beefed up 3/4 ton truck. It just has extra springs. But the thing that's different about this truck is that, of course, if you've been watching this channel for a while, thank you for one, but two, you know that the L122 that I've got is a Coleman conversion. So it's a little bit larger truck. It probably weighs as much, if not more, than a standard 1 ton. That'll come into play in a little bit, but first, so I'm installing a period correct brake booster system. When it comes down to 1950s trucks, the name of the game in brake boosters was the Bendix Hydrovac. Hydrovac gets its name because it uses vacuum off of the manifold to boost the hydraulic brake pressure. I figured before I install this thing, I'd give a little bit of background on it and give you a crash course on how it works, because it's pretty simple, it's pretty ingenious, but it's not really intuitive if you've never really had one apart. Before I get into how it works, I wanted to really just touch on quick how it's laid out as compared to a modern brake booster system. A modern brake booster system is an integrated design with the master cylinder and is typically mounted on the firewall on the driver's side of the motor bay in a modern vehicle. Hydrovac is a divorced design, whereas the booster unit is mounted on the frame rail of the vehicle somewhere, and it's completely separate from the master cylinder, and it just has brake lines and vacuum lines running to it. As far as how it works, for this project right here, all you need to know is that, one, vacuum is negative pressure. You could even consider it negative atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure is just the air around us. And you may think that atmospheric pressure has no pressure because we sit here and we breathe it all the time. But actually, atmospheric pressure around sea level has about 15 pounds per square inch. What's really important is vacuum is negative pressure. Your motor creates vacuum just by how it works. If you have an old, naturally aspirated, carbureted motor, it creates manifold vacuum, what's called manifold vacuum. All you really need to know about this is that your manifold has vacuum, and that's what runs this. That's it. Just some quick notes on vacuum as it pertains to the automotive industry and what we're working on today. Atmospheric pressure and vacuum are measured in several different ways, but in the automotive industry, they're measured in inches, which is short for inches of mercury, which again, we don't need to understand. It's just a unit of measurement. Now, if your vehicle has a vacuum gauge, it will read from 0 to 30 inches. A healthy motor will produce between a few inches of vacuum to the mid-20s, depending on what the motor's doing. Your vacuum gauge will have 30 on it as a maximum, but your motor will never reach it, and if it does, there's something wrong with your gauge. Vacuum is lowest at acceleration and high RPMs. Vacuum is high at idle, and vacuum is the absolute highest at high RPM deceleration. Coincidentally, that's what makes vacuum brakes so effective, because typically in the whatever the motor is doing at the time that you hit your brakes is generally deceleration. So it's going to be most effective. Coincidentally, it is also why vacuum wipers are the absolute worst thing ever. If you've ever had vacuum wipers and you notice that when you're hauling ass down the highway and they're barely moving, and then you get to a dead stop at a stop sign or a stoplight and they just go crazy. So that said, anybody on here who has vacuum wipers and likes them, please comment, because I've never met anybody who has. All right, so we all know that high pressure will always rush in to equalize low pressure, much like putting compressed air into a flat tire. Hydrovac works on the same principle, except the low pressure is so low that it's actually negative. So when you apply the brakes, you have high pressure coming in to equalize with negative pressure, causing an immediate and powerful reaction. Let's get into how this works. This is actually the actual Bendix Hydrovac unit I'll be installing on the truck. That one's just a spare. There's some others laying around here. Now, I had this unit rebuilt by Prior Automotive up in Mesquite, Texas. And there's several reasons why I prefer to have them work on them instead of doing it myself, which I typically do with most of my truck things. One is that Prior Automotive they've rebuilt every Hydrovac I've sent to them, and they've done an incredible job. Two, I don't have the desire to track down the kits and go through an entire process of rebuilding these. And actually, number three, which is probably should be number one, is that brakes are way too important to take chances on. And when I bolt in brakes, I redo a brake system, I am trying to minimize the amount of variables it comes down to if something could fail. And since nothing that Prior has ever touched for me has been a problem, that's one thing I just don't have to worry about. Now, there's also a fourth reason, is that around the nation right now, I'm in the US, I don't know where you're watching this, but in the United States right now, there are several shops left that will remanufacture and rebuild Hydrovacs. That business won't survive unless they get business. So when I have to set off a Hydrovac, I would prefer to be able to send it to somebody. I know there's shops around other than Prior that still do this. I've heard good things about, but have no personal experience with. It's Power Brake Sales in Sacramento, California, and Power Brake Exchange, I believe they're in San Jose, California. Now, why do I know of two in California? Well, it's because the last two trucks I saved were out of California in that general area. So besides the Hydrovac unit itself, the system has some components that are important to its operation, one of which being a check valve. Now, clearly this is a decrepit old check valve. It needs some serious attention, but this is actually the type of check valve that I've installed in the system. The actual one that I'm installing is already on the truck. I installed it months ago when I just started this project. So just to show you how it works, this is coming from the manifold. So vacuum is sucking towards the manifold, and this is a check valve. And so this goes down to the booster, and this goes to the gauge on the dash. How the check valve works is if the vacuum being produced by the manifold falls below what's on the booster side of the check valve, this thing will suck shut. This will maintain maximum vacuum inside the booster in case you need to use your brakes. So then when the manifold, inevitably starts producing more vacuum, this valve will open back up again. Basically ensures that no matter what, the booster has the most vacuum available. Now, this line going to the gauge, this thing can be on either side of the check valve. I prefer it to be on the booster side so I know how much vacuum I have for brakes. But if you have it on the manifold side of the check valve, it can tell you what's going on with your motor at all times. Another important thing for this system, air filter. When your Hydrovac gets activated, it sucks in a lot of fresh air just like immediately. You just have to make sure it's filtered. So this is actually an original. This is another kind for a larger type of Hydrovac, and you'll find this in the larger trucks, and this actually goes through the floor of the cab. And so it just basically filters air that's underneath the seat of the truck. And the reason they do that is because you want the air filter in a place where it's not going to get full of water. It's generally pretty clean. This type of air filter, this one that I'm installing on the truck, This one actually goes on the firewall. So it's up from where the booster is mounted, which is on the frame rail, like I said. On an international truck, these are almost always on the passenger side frame rail under the cab skirt. So it's pretty much basically right behind the front wheel in that splash area. So you really want this out of anywhere that dirt and mud and water and stuff are going to splash up into it. So these typically, you'll find them mounted usually right next to the check valve on the firewall. So another thing that's handy to have in a vacuum system is a vacuum reservoir, which does pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It just holds a reserve of vacuum. If you don't have a reservoir, the only vacuum that your brake system has is what's in the booster at the moment and whatever is in the line of the check valve. Or if the check valve is open, whatever is in the line to the manifold. You may notice that this is a pretty heavy-duty vacuum reservoir. If you are familiar with vacuum reservoirs, they're typically a glorified coffee can. In fact, people used to make them out of coffee cans. This is actually an old air compressor tank. But I got this and that booster as a core from Isaac, Icy Weld. You know, you've seen me in his videos. You've seen him in my videos. Great guy. He had a old 40s Chevy truck that I'm sure you'll see in some of his upcoming videos that he's building out. It's really cool. But he had the original chassis that was, he was just parting out, and he offered this stuff to me. I had a different Hydrovac for this project, but the core actually turned out to be too deteriorated to use. I'm going to touch on that in a minute. So anyway, this, it'll work just fine for a vacuum reservoir. I'm not installing this today because I don't have brackets for it that I'm happy with. So I have to make brackets for it. In the meantime, this will work just fine, but in the long run, I'm going to want this. When I got this, it had some condensation and weird oil stuff in it. So I cleaned it all out. I acid etched the inside of it, and I coated it with POR 15 fuel tank liner. Was that overkill? Yes. Is most of what I do overkill? Also yes. Anything worth doing is worth overdoing in my book. And I just didn't want there to be any rust or dirt or particles of anything in this tank that when filled with vacuum, it could suck into the Hydrovac and destroy the diaphragm that's in there. All right, so the vacuum from the manifold is introduced in this port right here. The vacuum fills this cylinder, which is odd to say because vacuum, like I said, is a negative. So a vacuum exists in this cylinder. There's a diaphragm that rests probably about right here, and there's a light tension spring that holds it back there in position. There's a push rod that is mounted in the center of the diaphragm, which is connected to a piston right here. This is a hydraulic cylinder. The brake fluid enters here from the master cylinder. Brake fluid exits out of this outlet right here and goes into the brake line to the wheel cylinders. This is the atmosphere port, or you could say the fresh air port. Now the diaphragm that sits here in the cylinder with a light tension spring on it, the spring is only there to hold this thing in position back here. When the diaphragm is resting in this position, the spring is fully extended with no tension on it. When the brakes are applied, fluid from the master cylinder puts pressure on these valves here. When the atmosphere valve is cracked open, the vacuum valve seals shut and positive pressure atmosphere rushes in down through this tube and around to the back side of the cylinder. Now, with the diaphragm here, vacuum on one side and positive pressure atmosphere on the other side, the diaphragm and push rod are sent rocketing forward, and this hydraulic piston forces brake fluid through the hydraulic cylinder and out into the brake line, increasing brake pedal pressure significantly. And that's basically how it works. One bonus part to this install is this Miko brake lock, or Miko, depending on who you ask on how to pronounce it. This is a vintage Miko brake lock. Basically, it's just a hydraulic check valve that goes in the line for the brakes. They're really handy for things like winching when you need to lock up all the brakes and the driveline. Handbrake just isn't enough. These are very popular with hot rodders because you can actually lock up your front wheels and do burnouts with them. But obviously they're a perfect necessity for old trucks. That's typically where you find them Now, these are typically on the dash. Actually, this is the most popular kind. It's called the lever lock. You know, flip the lever up, it's locked, flip it down. So, doing burnouts, you'd have the lever up and then you just put her down and take off. However, this one's so cool because I had to say first that I'm a collector. And I don't mean like I collect, like I need to have all the trucks or anything, but like when I have a project going, I like to do things that are period correct. Typically, those parts are hard to find, so I'll collect stuff, over a long period of time until I have all the components in hand, and then I do the project. And I've been collecting components for doing this ever since I got the truck. So this is a very hard to find Meco cable activated. You can see it has the same body as the lever lock, but it has the actuator is a cable pull. Now what's so cool about the cable pull, like I said, Mecos are typically mounted on the dash, and you have to pipe up brake line from either the master or somewhere in the brake line up to the dash and then back down to the brake line. Whereas this, I can put directly in front of the booster and lock it from there. It's activated by a pull cable in the cab, and I tracked down an original Meco pull cable. So pretty stoked about this. I have to say, this has nothing to do with the brake booster system, so I'm not going to get too into it. I have a Meco video that I've been planning to make for a long time, and so I'll explain all about Mecos at that point. But I just wanted to bring this up now because when I install this is going to be in the shot, and I don't want it confusing anybody. So that's what this is. It's a brake lock, it's a check valve, just, a modern way of saying it is a hydraulic line lock. So that's what this is. One thing I'd like to mention about the Hydrovac. Hydrovac is suited to a brake system based on the volume of the brake system, the bore and stroke of the master cylinder, and the weight of the vehicle. Now, for my International that I'm putting this on, which is technically a 3/4 ton, Bendix made a Hydrovac that was called the Tonner. Basically, it was optimized for 1-ton vehicles, hence the name. The original core that I had was a tonner, but it was, like I said, the core was unusable. So I had this core as a backup, so it's getting this. This is actually the same model Hydrovac that's on my S160, which is a much bigger truck. My concerns with this is that this might be too powerful for my brake system. What could that do? Possibly it could blow out the cups in the wheel cylinders. We'll see. It might be too violent on the stops. We'll see. One thing that the Coleman conversion has going for it in this case, it has larger wheel cylinders than a stock International 3/4 ton. A stock 3/4 ton International or a stock 1-ton, they have single-sided wheel cylinders in the front, whereas the Coleman axle actually has large 2-sided wheel cylinders. That might be a saving grace. It might not. There's a lot of things, but basically I'm going to be keeping an eye on it, and I'll definitely make a follow-up video for this install so we can see how it's doing probably a few months from now. Hopefully in a few months it'll be like, well, I've been driving for a few months, nothing went wrong, instead of next week, guess what, everything's ruined. So that's actually the only concern I have for this install, is this Hydrovac being too much for that brake system. These Hydrovac systems, when properly maintained, are extremely effective, to the point that Della, the S160 4x4, will actually, when you hit the brakes, those front brakes will grab so tight that it will lift the rear axle slightly up off the ground, which is impressive. That's a heavy truck. And that's the same booster unit that I'm putting into this beefed up 3/4 ton. So we'll see. Okay, let's see it on the truck. On a 1950 to 57 International truck, the Hydrovac is installed on the outside passenger frame rail under the cab skirt. Our Meco is right in front of it, with a short brake line connecting the outlet of the booster to the inlet of the Meco. On a 1950 to 57 International truck, there's a short brake line running from the master cylinder to a 3-way banjo brake fitting that goes to the left front brake hose and out the sides to the rest of the system. Now on this one, I remember installing this one in the junkyard and it was a problem. You see it looks like crap. The problem is that it's going into that fitting, but this motor is from a 63 International. So that oil filter is in the way. We're going to delete the short brake line and then align back from the Hydrovac outlet, or in this case the Miko, to the banjo fitting. And run a line from the master cylinder to the Hydrovac. That's the only brake line work we need to do. The vacuum check valve is mounted on the passenger side firewall. Like I said, I installed this check valve a few months ago in anticipation of this project. There's a vacuum line running from the manifold vacuum port to the check valve. The small line is running to the dash vacuum gauge. Next to the check valve, we have the air filter mounted. A vacuum line runs from the check valve to Hydrovac vacuum port. If you're running a vacuum reservoir, you'll either install it in line between the booster and the check valve, or you'll install it branching off a T-fitting before the vacuum line reaches the booster. That's how I prefer to do it. However, I'm not installing the reservoir just yet, so I have it plugged off on that end. From the booster's atmosphere port, a line runs back up to the firewall to the air filter. Alright, now that I have my Hydrovac mounted in place and all my lines run, I have to bleed the entire system. Bleeding a master cylinder is easy. Simply make a small fitting out of a short piece of brake line and hose. Run the hose back into the master cylinder reservoir. Submerge the end of the hose into the fluid and pump the pedal until no more bubbles come out. Then remove the bleeder fitting and reattach the system brake lines. Bleeding a Hydrovac is also easy, but there's one correct way to do it. You start at the top bleeder here. With the motor off, apply one stroke of the brake pedal, hold it and crack the bleeder. Then tighten the bleeder, release the brake pedal. Repeat until there are no bubbles left. You do not pump up the brakes and then crack the bleeder. You do it one pump at a time. When the top bleeder is finished, you move to the lower bleeder. Now, if you're an impatient person or just don't have all the time in the world, like I don't, I suggest you track down a set of speed bleeders for your booster. Then you can just crack the bleeder, and every time you apply the pedal and release it, it's doing all those steps for you. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the Hydrovac install. I hope you found it helpful, somewhat educational, and not too rambling and incoherent. If you dug this video, there's more coming up. Please like and subscribe. That helps me out a lot. I've also had some requests for shirts and merch, mostly on Instagram, some on here. And so I just want to say that I do have a small online store now. I actually have this new design that I think is pretty cool. This is a hoodie that I actually ordered for myself. Bare knuckle binder, it's not slow, it's majestic. Bare knuckle binder on the front. Anyway, I put the link in the description. That's it, stay tuned for upcoming videos. And also, speaking of upcoming videos, if you've been looking at this total eye candy, refurbished, restored Aero Gear Company PTO drive, this is coming up in a video soon. You're not going to want to miss this. Coleman is finally getting a bumper winch. All right, y'all be safe. Thanks for watching.